When the catastrophic engine explosion ripped through United Flight 2847 at 37,000 feet, nobody looked twice at the quiet woman in seat 23F, the same passenger they'd ignored for an hour, dressed in faded jeans and reading a paperback novel. But when she stepped into that failing cockpit and the F-22 Raptor pilots overhead heard her legendary call sign transmitted across military frequencies, two of America's most elite fighter pilots immediately rolled their stealth jets inverted in the sacred missing man salute. What could make seasoned combat aviators honor a complete stranger flying in an economy seat? Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was Wednesday, March 15, 2025, at approximately 6:45 in the morning when passengers began boarding United Airlines Flight 2847 at Denver International Airport. The Boeing 777-300ER was scheduled for departure at 7:30 a.m., bound for Washington Dulles International Airport on what was expected to be a routine 3.5-hour flight. Among the 288 passengers, a woman in her early 40s moved quietly through the jet bridge wearing faded jeans, a plain gray sweater and worn running shoes. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a weathered leather messenger bag and a small rolling suitcase. The lead flight attendant, Jessica Martinez, offered her the same practiced smile she gave every passenger. "Good morning, welcome aboard," she said cheerfully, her eyes already moving to the next person. The woman nodded politely and made her way to seat 23F, a window seat in economy class. She settled in without fanfare, placing her bag under the seat and pulling out a worn paperback novel. Nothing about her suggested she was anything other than an ordinary traveler on a routine domestic flight. The man in seat 23E, dressed in a rumpled business suit, barely acknowledged her as he typed frantically on his laptop, apparently rushing to finish urgent work before departure. A young woman in yoga pants and a university sweatshirt dropped into seat 23D, immediately plugging in her earbuds and scrolling through her phone. Neither passenger gave the woman in the window seat a second glance. She was invisible, unremarkable, just another face in the crowd. As the final passengers boarded and the flight attendants completed their safety checks, the woman read her book calmly. When Jessica came through offering beverages after takeoff, she ordered water with no ice, received it with a quiet thank you and continued reading. The flight attendant moved on without a second thought, having already forgotten the passenger in 23F among the hundreds of routine interactions she performed every day. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Harrison and First Officer Amanda Chen had reviewed their flight plan and weather briefing. Everything looked perfect for an on-time departure and smooth flight. At 7:28 a.m., 2 minutes ahead of schedule, Flight 2847 pushed back from the gate. Captain Harrison's voice came over the PA system with the standard welcome and flight information. The woman in 23F listened politely, having heard similar announcements hundreds of times before. The big Boeing taxied to runway 34R and at 7:41 a.m., the captain advanced the throttles. The aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the Colorado morning sky. The woman glanced at her watch, 7:44 a.m., and returned to her book as the aircraft climbed through the clouds toward its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. The flight proceeded normally for the first hour. Passengers settled into their routines, working on laptops, watching movies on seatback screens, sleeping or scrolling through phones. The beverage service came and went. The woman in 23F occasionally glanced out the window at the patchwork farmland of Kansas far below, but mostly she read her book, appearing completely content and unremarkable. The businessman in 23E never looked up from his spreadsheets. The young woman in 23D never stopped scrolling through social media. At 8:47 a.m., approximately 1 hour into the flight with the aircraft cruising smoothly over central Kansas, everything changed in an instant. Captain Harrison was about to make a routine passenger announcement when both pilots simultaneously noticed alarming indications on their engine instruments. The number 1 engine pressure ratio was dropping rapidly, exhaust gas temperature was spiking into the red zone, and warning lights illuminated across the overhead panel. "We've got a problem with number 1, Harrison said urgently. Before First Officer Chen could respond, a tremendous bang shook the entire aircraft, loud enough to make passengers gasp and grab their armrests. The woman in 23F's book fell from her lap as the aircraft lurched violently left. She immediately looked out the window, her eyes moving with analytical precision. Pieces of engine cowling were separating from the number 1 engine, trailing smoke and debris. In the cockpit, alarm bells screamed and master warning lights flashed red. "Number 1 engine failure," Chen called out, reaching for the emergency checklist. Harrison fought the control yoke, trying to level the wings, but the aircraft wasn't responding normally. "I've got severe flight control degradation," he reported tensely. "Hydraulic pressure dropping on systems A and C. We're losing multiple systems." The aircraft continued rolling left despite Harrison's maximum control inputs. Oxygen masks suddenly dropped throughout the cabin with a loud whoosh, yellow tubes and plastic cups swinging wildly. Passengers screamed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain." Harrison's voice cut through the panic, speaking quickly but with forced calm. "We have experienced an engine emergency. Put on your oxygen masks immediately and remain seated with seatbelts fastened." Jessica Martinez grabbed the interphone from the aft galley after being thrown against the wall. "Flight deck, what's our status?" she asked urgently. "Uncontained engine failure, multiple system failures, declaring emergency," Harrison replied tersely. "Prepare cabin for possible evacuation." The woman in 23F secured her oxygen mask with quick, certain movements, unlike the other passengers who fumbled with the unfamiliar equipment. Her eyes scanned the damaged engine through the window, trailing heavy smoke but no visible fire. She was calculating mentally. Single engine failure, hydraulic problems, flight control issues, over Kansas with limited airport options. The closest major airport was Kansas City, about 180 miles northeast, but with severe control problems, even reaching it might be impossible. Chin coordinated with air traffic control. "Kansas Center, United 2847 Heavy, declaring emergency, uncontained failure number 1 engine with multiple secondary system failures, requesting immediate vectors nearest suitable airport, souls on board 288. The controller responded instantly with urgent efficiency. "United 2847 Heavy, Roger, emergency declared, turn left heading 040, vectors Kansas City International, distance 170 miles. But when Harrison attempted the turn, he encountered a terrifying problem. The flight controls barely responded, requiring enormous physical force to move the yoke, and the aircraft's response was sluggish and unpredictable. "Amanda, we've got a major problem," he said grimly. "I can barely control this aircraft. We may have structural damage to the wing or control surfaces." The cabin had descended into chaos. Passengers were crying, praying, calling loved ones despite the oxygen masks. Flight attendants tried to check passengers while the aircraft pitched and rolled unpredictably. The businessman in 23E gripped his armrests with white knuckles, eyes squeezed shut. The young woman in 23D sobbed quietly, her phone clutched to her chest. But the woman in 23F remained calm, breathing steadily through her oxygen mask, her eyes constantly moving between the window and cabin, observing and analyzing. She noticed the wing flexing abnormally, suggesting structural compromise. She smelled smoke filtering into the cabin. She heard the remaining engine straining at maximum power, producing vibrations that suggested dangerous overstress. She unbuckled and stood up. A flight attendant immediately called out, "Ma'am, you need to remain seated." The woman ignored her and pressed the call button 3 times rapidly, a military signal for urgent cockpit communication. She moved forward through the cabin, walking with practiced stability despite the aircraft's erratic movements, automatically adjusting her balance like someone who had maneuvered through countless aircraft in flight. Jessica Martinez intercepted her near row 15. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat immediately." The woman looked at her with calm, intense eyes that made Jessica pause. "I need to speak with your flight deck crew immediately. I have information that can help them." Something in her voice made Jessica make a split-second decision against protocol. "Follow me." Jessica picked up the cockpit interphone. "Flight deck, I have a passenger who says she's a pilot and needs to speak with you urgently." Harrison's frustrated voice came back. "Jessica, we don't have time for passenger concerns right now." The woman reached for the interphone and Jessica handed it to her. "Captain, this is Colonel Sarah Reeves, United States Air Force, retired. I need you to listen very carefully because I've flown damaged aircraft worse than this, and I know how to get you on the ground." Dead silence. Then Harrison's voice, surprised and skeptical but desperate. "Who did you say you are?" The woman spoke clearly. "Colonel Sarah Reeves, call sign Phoenix, formerly commander of the 65th Aggressor Squadron, former test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base, 4,800 flight hours in tactical aircraft including F-22, F-35, F-16, and F-15, combat veteran with 3 tours. I was heading to Washington for Pentagon meetings. I'm looking at your damage from the cabin. I can hear what your aircraft is doing, and I know you're dealing with asymmetric thrust, degraded hydraulics and possible structural damage. Chen's voice came on. Colonel Reeves, can you verify that information? Sarah didn't hesitate. Your captain is Robert Harrison. You're flying a 777-300ER at approximately 35,000 feet. You've lost number 1 engine with uncontained failure, hydraulic failures in at least 2 systems based on flight control response, and you're trying to make Kansas City but you're not sure you can control the aircraft well enough. How am I doing? Harrison's voice came back, deadly serious. That's accurate. Colonel, I'm not sure what you think you can do from the cabin. Sarah's response was firm. Captain Harrison, I've landed damaged F-22s with complete hydraulic failure, I've brought burning aircraft back to base when everyone was ready to eject, and I've saved crews and aircraft that should have been unflyable. I can help you if you'll listen. Your biggest problem isn't the engine, you can fly on 1 engine. Your problem is flight control degradation, and I believe you have cable damage or control surface damage making your conventional inputs ineffective. Harrison and Chin exchanged glances. They were out of options. Harrison made the decision. Send her up. The cockpit door unlocked and Sarah moved through quickly. Her eyes immediately scanned the instrument panels, taking in the cascade of warning lights and Harrison's physical strain fighting the controls. She positioned herself between the pilot seats, one hand bracing against the overhead panel. Captain, First Officer, trust me for the next few minutes. What's your flight control response like when you use differential thrust instead of primary controls? Harrison looked surprised. I haven't tried that. We're trained to use normal controls. Sarah nodded. I understand, but you're not in a standard situation. Your control surfaces are damaged, but your remaining engine is producing full power. You've got a powerful tool if you know how to use it. She pointed to the throttle controls. Captain, reduce power on engine 2 to about 60%. Harrison hesitated. That will reduce available power and might put us in an unrecoverable descent. Sarah's voice remained calm but insistent. Right now you're fighting the aircraft because you're trying to use controls that aren't working properly. By reducing power, you reduce the asymmetric condition making the aircraft roll left. You'll gain more control authority, not less. Trust me, I've done this before. Harrison looked at Chin, who nodded slightly. He slowly pulled back the throttle to 60%. Immediately, the aircraft's roll tendency decreased dramatically, and he could level the wings with far less physical effort. My God, that actually worked, he said with relief. Sarah continued. Now try something unconventional. Instead of using yoke and rudder for directional control, use differential thrust. Small power changes on your remaining engine will give you directional control without relying on damaged flight controls. Over the next 10 minutes, Sarah coached them through techniques never taught in commercial aviation but standard in military test pilot schools. They learned to fly the crippled 777 using differential thrust for turns, careful pitch control, and precise energy state management. The aircraft was still severely damaged but now controllable, which meant survival was possible. Sarah studied the navigation display. Captain, I'm concerned about Kansas City. You'll have to execute a complex approach with multiple turns, and with your control limitations, every turn is a risk. Is there any closer airport with a long, straight approach? Chin consulted the computer. There's Forbes Field near Topeka, a former Air Force base about 85 miles at our 11 o'clock. Single runway but 12,800 feet long, and the approach from the west is almost perfectly straight. Sarah nodded immediately. That's your best option. Long runway, straight approach, former military field with emergency equipment and experience with unusual emergencies. Request vectors to Forbes Field immediately. Harrison didn't hesitate. Kansas Center United 2847 Heavy, requesting immediate vectors Forbes Field, Topeka, Kansas. The controller responded with confusion. United 2847 Heavy, did you say Forbes Field? That's much smaller with limited facilities. Are you sure? Sarah reached for the radio and Harrison gestured for her to take it. Kansas Center, this is United 2847 Heavy, we have a highly experienced military pilot on board assisting. Forbes Field is our best option given our control limitations. We need that long straight approach now. Brief pause. United 2847 Heavy, roger, turn right heading 050, vectors direct Forbes Field, distance 82 miles. Forbes Field has been notified and is preparing for your arrival. Emergency equipment is rolling. What is the name of the military pilot assisting? Sarah keyed the radio. Kansas Center, assisting pilot is Colonel Sarah Reeves, United States Air Force, retired, call sign Phoenix. In the Kansas City Air Route Traffic Control Center, The controller suddenly sat up straighter. He was former Air Force and he knew that call sign. Every military aviator knew that call sign. He immediately called McConnell Air Force Base Operations. This is Kansas Center, civilian ATC. Emergency aircraft inbound Forbes Field and Colonel Sarah Reeves, call sign Phoenix, is on board assisting. You need to know about this right now. At McConnell, Major Tom Bradley grabbed the phone and listened, his face going pale. Within minutes, alerts went out to Air Combat Command Headquarters, the Pentagon and every fighter squadron in the region. The name Sarah Reeves, call sign Phoenix, was legendary. The pilot who shot down 4 enemy fighters in a single engagement, the test pilot who discovered and corrected a fatal F-22 flaw that had killed 2 pilots, the squadron commander who led an impossible rescue mission when everyone said it couldn't be done. Aboard Flight 2847, Sarah was functioning as a third pilot, calling out airspeed, altitude, and power settings while Harrison and Chin executed the approach to Forbes Field. The aircraft descended through 15,000 feet with Topeka appearing on the horizon. Sarah had them configure for landing much earlier than normal because every configuration change would create new control challenges needing plenty of altitude and time to manage. Captain, extend flaps to position 5 very slowly, and be ready to counter the pitch change with power adjustments, not yoke input, Sarah instructed. Harrison complied carefully, and with Sarah's coaching, managed the configuration change smoothly. Perfect. You're getting it. This aircraft will fight you all the way to the ground, but if you stay ahead of it and use power management instead of control surfaces, you can keep it stable. Forbes Field Tower cleared all traffic and positioned every emergency vehicle along the runway. The airport manager, a retired Air Force colonel, stood in the tower watching through binoculars. When he heard the name Sarah Reeves over the radio, he grabbed the console edge to steady himself. Did he just say Phoenix is on that aircraft? At 9:23 a.m., United Flight 2847 was 5 miles from Forbes Field, descending through 3,000 feet with flaps at 20 degrees and landing gear down and locked. Sarah called out instructions in calm, measured cadence. Airspeed 185 knots, sync rate 700 feet per minute, looking good. Captain, you'll feel the aircraft want to roll left when you extend full flaps, so add 5% power 1 second before you move the flap lever. Harrison followed her instructions precisely. At 3 miles and 2,000 feet, Forbes Field was clearly visible with emergency vehicles lining both sides, lights flashing. Sarah continued. 2 miles, sync rate 600, airspeed 180, right on profile. Captain, you're doing an outstanding job. First Officer Chin, be ready to call out altitudes through the flare. At 1 mile and 1,000 feet, Sarah gave final instructions. Captain Harrison, this landing will be different from anything you've done. You cannot flare normally because you don't have the control authority. Fly it onto the runway at approximately 300 feet per minute descent rate. Don't try to arrest the descent, just accept a firm landing and use thrust for pitch control all the way to touchdown. As soon as you touch, pull power to idle, deploy spoilers and use maximum reverse thrust and brakes. You'll need every foot of that runway. Harrison's hands trembled slightly but his voice stayed steady. Understood. Flying it on, firm landing, maximum deceleration. Chin called altitudes. 500 feet, 400, 300, sync rate 350, airspeed 175. Sarah added her callouts. Looking good, staying stable, you've got this, Captain. The Boeing 777 crossed the threshold at 200 feet. At 100 feet, Harrison could see individual runway markings. 50 feet, 40, 30, 20, 10, Chin called. The main gear struck the runway with a tremendous thud, bouncing slightly before settling. Spoilers deployed, reverse thrust, maximum braking. Harrison called out, working the controls furiously as the aircraft thundered down the runway. The aircraft passed the 4,000-foot marker, still traveling over 100 knots. At 6,000 feet, 80 knots. At 8,000 feet, the brakes took full effect. At 10,000 feet with 2,800 feet remaining, United Flight 2847 rolled to a complete stop, smoke pouring from overheated brakes and the damaged engine, but intact with all 288 souls aboard safe. Harrison slumped forward, his hands still gripping the yoke, trembling. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. Outstanding flying, Captain. You just accomplished something most pilots couldn't have done. You saved everyone on this aircraft. Harrison looked up with tears in his eyes. Colonel Reeves, you saved all of us. Those techniques, I've never seen anything like that. Sarah smiled slightly. Captain, when you fly fighters in combat and test aircraft, you learn to fly aircraft that don't want to be flown. Today you learned some of those lessons. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds. Inside the cabin, passengers cried, hugged, and broke into spontaneous applause. Jessica Martinez made her way to the cockpit and grabbed Sarah in a fierce embrace. "Thank you for saving all of us." Before Sarah could leave the cockpit, Harrison stood and blocked her path. "Colonel Reeves, you're not going anywhere until you tell me your story. Where did you learn to fly like that?" Sarah hesitated but recognized he deserved an answer. "Captain, I spent 22 years in the Air Force flying fighters and test aircraft. The techniques I showed you, differential thrust management, power-based flight control, energy state management. Those are standard curriculum in military test pilot schools because when you're testing new aircraft or flying damaged ones, conventional techniques don't always work." Before Harrison could respond, a voice crackled over the emergency radio. "United 2847 Heavy, this is Raptor 1-1 flight of 2 F-22s. We're overhead your position at Angels 25, scrambled from Whiteman Air Force Base when your emergency was declared. Is there a Colonel Sarah Reeves on board?" Harrison picked up the microphone. "Raptor 1-1, this is United 2847, we are safely on the ground, all souls safe, and yes, Colonel Reeves is on board and just saved this aircraft and everyone on it." Silence, then a younger voice filled with awe. "United 2847, Raptor 1-2, did you say Phoenix is on board? Colonel Sarah Reeves, call sign Phoenix?" Sarah reached for the microphone. "Raptor flight, this is Phoenix. Confirm I'm on board United 2847. Who am I talking to?" The response came with a smile in the voice. "Phoenix, this is Captain Jake Mitchell, call sign Viper, and my wingman is Captain Rachel Torres, call sign Blade. Ma'am, we need permission to make a low pass over your position. The entire fighter community needs to know you're safe." Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time. "Raptor flight, Phoenix, you are cleared for your low pass. Make it a good one." She pointed out the windscreen toward two small dots growing rapidly larger. Within seconds, two F-22 Raptors screamed toward Forbes Field at over 600 miles per hour, dropping from 25,000 feet. The F-22s leveled at exactly 500 feet above the runway, precisely aligned with the stopped 777. As they passed overhead with a thunderous roar, both fighters simultaneously rolled inverted, flying upside down in perfect formation. The missing man, salute reserved only for the most honored aviators. As they rolled upright and climbed vertically, both pilots had their hands raised in salute. Harrison and Chin watched with mouths open. "Colonel Reeves," Harrison said slowly, "those F-22 pilots just performed an unauthorized aerobatic maneuver over a civilian airport during an emergency. They could face disciplinary action. Why would they risk that?" Sarah looked at him with emotion rarely shown. "Captain, in the fighter pilot community, there are bonds and traditions beyond regulations. Those pilots just told me and everyone watching that I'm one of them, that I'm respected, and that my service mattered. They'll face paperwork, but it will be worth it to them." As passengers evacuated using mobile stairs, word spread through military aviation at lightning speed. At Whiteman Air Force Base, Captain Mitchell and Captain Torres landed and immediately faced their squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel David Price, standing on the flight line with arms crossed. Before Price could speak, Mitchell said, "Sir, Colonel Sarah Reeves was on that aircraft. Phoenix saved everyone aboard. We had to honor her." Price's stern expression melted. "Phoenix was on that flight? And she saved it?" Mitchell nodded. "Yes, sir. She coached them through landing a severely damaged aircraft using techniques they'd never seen." Price shook his head. "You'll still write reports about that unauthorized maneuver, but I'm not pursuing discipline. Phoenix earned that salute. Now write those reports while I call Air Combat Command. They need to know." At Air Combat Command headquarters at Langley, the watch officer fielded multiple calls about the emergency and Colonel Reeves's involvement. Within 30 minutes, the information reached General Marcus Thompson, ACC commander and former F-15 pilot who had flown combat alongside Sarah. He immediately called General Patricia Morrison, Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force. "Pat, Colonel Sarah Reeves, retired, was on a commercial flight with catastrophic emergency, and she saved the aircraft using advanced tactical flying techniques," Thompson reported. Morrison responded decisively. "Marcus, I want a full briefing within the hour. Sarah Reeves is one of our most decorated combat pilots. If she's back in the news for heroics, I want every detail. Also consider this, she retired 3 years ago but clearly operates at the highest levels. We need people like her in training programs. Let's see if we can convince her to come back." At Forbes Field, passenger evacuation progressed smoothly. Sarah tried to blend in, But Jessica had told every flight attendant who she was and what she'd done, and word spread among passengers rapidly. As Sarah walked down the mobile stairs, exhausted and wanting a quiet corner, she found herself surrounded by passengers wanting to thank her, shake her hand, hug her. The businessman from 23E, who had never acknowledged her during the flight, stood before her with tears streaming. "Ma'am, I don't even know your name, but because of you, I'm going to see my wife and 2 children again. Thank you." The young woman from 23D, who had treated Sarah as invisible, grabbed her in a fierce embrace and sobbed. "You saved my life. You saved all of us. You're a hero." Sarah accepted their thanks with quiet grace, uncomfortable with attention but recognizing these people needed to express gratitude as part of processing their trauma. Airport security finally escorted her to a private office. The airport manager, Colonel Mike Henderson, retired Air Force F-16 pilot, entered and extended his hand with reverence. "Colonel Reeves, I'm Colonel Henderson, retired airport manager here. I flew F-16s for 20 years and I know exactly who you are. It's an honor to meet you and know you landed safely at my airport." Before long there was a knock on the door. A security officer poked his head in. "Colonel Henderson, sir, situation developing outside. Word got out about Colonel Reeves and what she did. News crews setting up, military officers arriving from multiple bases, lots of people wanting to see her." Henderson looked at Sarah with concern. "Colonel, I can keep them away if you want privacy." Sarah smiled tiredly. "Colonel Henderson, I've learned sometimes you have to face the attention. Let's deal with it now." Henderson led her to the main terminal. Sarah was genuinely surprised by what she saw. The terminal was filled with people. Passengers, airport workers, emergency responders, and at least a dozen military personnel in uniform who had driven from various bases. As she entered, everyone spontaneously began applauding, thunderous sound echoing off walls and ceiling. Sarah stopped, overwhelmed, feeling her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. Among the crowd, several people in Air Force flight suits with fighter squadron patches were not applauding. They stood rigidly at attention, hands raised in salute, faces showing respect and admiration needing no words. Sarah recognized several as pilots she had trained years ago, now senior captains and majors. She instinctively straightened to attention and returned their salutes with career military crispness, bringing fresh applause. One pilot, a major she recognized, approached. "Colonel Reeves, ma'am, I'm Major Scott Davidson. We flew together at Nellis 5 years ago when you ran the 65th Aggressors. When we heard you were on that flight and saved it, we had to come. You taught me everything about flying damaged aircraft and handling emergencies. Sounds like you put on a masterclass today." Sarah gripped his hand firmly. "Major Davidson, I remember you as a lieutenant, one of my best students. Good to see you wearing major's leaves." A commotion at the entrance announced more senior officers, led by a 2-star general. The crowd parted, and Major General William Crawford, commander of 8th Air Force, walked directly to Sarah with a broad smile. "Colonel Reeves, I flew here as soon as I heard because I needed to personally thank you and tell you the entire Air Force is proud of you." Sarah came to attention and saluted. Crawford returned the salute before extending his hand. "Colonel, let's dispense with formalities. I reviewed the radio recordings and Captain Harrison's NTSB debriefing. What you did was extraordinary. You took 2 commercial pilots who'd never trained for that emergency and taught them advanced test pilot techniques in real time while the aircraft failed around them. That's instruction that normally takes months in formal test pilot school." As Crawford spoke, news crews broadcast live, and the story spread across social media and networks. Within an hour, footage of Sarah's arrival, the fighter pilot salutes, and Crawford's praise was shared by millions. National networks picked up the story, and Colonel Sarah Reeves, call sign Phoenix, became the trending topic nationwide. The Air Force Public Affairs Office fielded hundreds of media requests and quickly assembled her biographical summary, 3 combat tours with multiple air-to-air kills including the famous engagement where she shot down 4 enemy fighters protecting a rescue helicopter. Test pilot at Edwards, instrumental in F-22 and F-35 development. Commander of the 65th Aggressor Squadron training hundreds of fighter pilots. Numerous decorations including Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters, Air Medal with 15 oak leaf clusters. News anchors called her one of the most decorated female combat pilots in Air Force history, and a living legend in the fighter pilot community. Retired aviation experts appeared on programs explaining her accomplishments. One retired 3-star general told CNN, "Colonel Sarah Reeves represents the absolute pinnacle of military aviation excellence. Her call sign Phoenix was earned because she had an uncanny ability to bring damaged aircraft back from situations that should have been fatal. What she did today was completely consistent with her entire career. She saw a desperate situation, assessed what needed to be done, and executed flawlessly. As evening fell and arrangements were made to transport passengers to Washington on other flights, Sarah stepped outside into the cool Kansas air to process everything. She walked to a quiet area near the fence where she could see the damaged 777 still on the runway, surrounded by investigators. She thought about how close they'd come to disaster, how many factors had to align perfectly for survival, how random chance had placed her on that specific flight at that specific time. She heard footsteps and turned to find Captain Harrison and First Officer Chin approaching, both still in uniform, both exhausted. Harrison spoke first. "Colonel Reeves, Amanda and I have been talking. We've been flying for a combined 35 years, and we thought we knew everything about handling aircraft emergencies. Today you showed us we'd barely scratched the surface of what's possible. You opened our eyes to a completely different level of aviation knowledge." Chin continued. "Colonel, in commercial aviation we're taught to rely on procedures, checklists, standard responses. It works 99.9% of the time. But we're never taught to think like you, to analyze fundamental aerodynamics, improvise solutions, use the aircraft in ways it wasn't designed for. You saved our lives and all our passengers, but you also taught us something invaluable about what it really means to be a pilot. I will never forget today, and I'll spend the rest of my career trying to live up to the example you set." Sarah felt emotions rising, exhaustion and adrenaline crash combining with genuine gratitude. "Captain Harrison, First Officer Chin, what I showed you wasn't magic or superhuman ability. It's just training, very specific, very intensive training the military provides to certain pilots expected to operate in extreme situations. Everything I know, I learned from instructors and mentors, and from experiences that forced me beyond what I thought possible. You both have the intelligence and skill to learn these techniques. Maybe this experience will inspire the airline industry to incorporate some of this training." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Colonel, I'll be advocating strongly for exactly that. The pilots' union, FAA, aircraft manufacturers, they all need to hear about today. This could change how we train commercial pilots." He extended his hand. "Thank you, Colonel Reeves. Thank you for my life, my crew's lives, all those passengers. I can never repay you, but I'll honor what you did by being a better pilot and sharing what I learned." As night fell and Sarah boarded a military transport, General Crawford had arranged to take her to Washington for her Pentagon meetings, she looked out the window at Forbes Field growing smaller below. She thought about the day's events, about how a routine flight had turned into life-or-death emergency, about how her skills had been exactly what was needed at exactly the right moment. She thought about the F-22 pilots who saluted from above, the young fighter pilots who stood at attention in the terminal, General Crawford's recognition. But mostly she thought about Captain Harrison and First Officer Chin, two dedicated professionals who had faced an impossible situation and trusted a complete stranger to guide them through it. She thought about their courage, adaptability, willingness to throw away everything they'd been taught and try something completely different. That was the real story, not her skills or techniques, but the capacity of good pilots to rise to extraordinary challenges when circumstances demanded it. The transport climbed into the darkening sky. Tomorrow she would face Pentagon meetings, intense media attention, official Air Force recognition, and requests to tell her story dozens of times. But tonight, for a few hours, she could be simply Colonel Sarah Reeves, call sign Phoenix, a pilot who had done what pilots do, solved a problem, saved lives, and lived to fly another day. And somewhere over the dark Kansas plains at 35,000 feet in a small military jet, that was enough.